The Amazon empire seems to be constantly reinventing itself, expanding to new products, brands, and even outer space. A new book titled Amazon Unbound, Jeff Bezos and the Invention of a Global Empire details the last decade or so of the company's massive growth and the transformation of its founder and CEO. The book is published by Simon & Schuster, a division of Viacom CBS. Author and journalist Brad Stone joins us now to discuss this. Thanks for joining us, Brad. So this is your second book on Amazon. Your first book was nearly a decade ago. It was called The Everything Store. It was a major hit. Lots of fans there, except for perhaps Jeff Bezos and his inner circle. One of the interesting revelations that came out of that book was that you found Jeff Bezos' biological father, who didn't even know that his son had grown up to become Jeff Bezos. So that put you in, let's say, an awkward position with the Bezos family. But you must be particularly charming because you managed to write another book and get some access this time around. How did that go?
Right. Well, perhaps time heals some wounds at least. And Amazon, now is a $1.6 trillion company. It sort of realizes it can no longer hide in plain sight. So they did work with me on this book. I probably interviewed a dozen or so senior executives. But, the foundation of these kinds of stories is always the people who, have left, who have stories to tell, who are reflecting back on Amazon's power, the remarkable transformation of Jeff Bezos right before our eyes, and the way the company operates and competes in markets, sometimes fairly, sometimes not.
So in the book, you mention, or you write about the evolution of Jeff Bezos, not just the way he runs his multi-billion-dollar company, but also his look and his attitude.
Yes.
Describe how he's changed since the early days of Amazon and how it's been reflected in the way that he does business. Because, one of the things I think, one of the misconceptions that I've always found that happens with people when they consider Jeff Bezos is they imagine him like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, like starting out in, the mythical garage and comes up with this great idea. But he wasn't that guy. He was already kind of a mover and a shaker in, the consulting investment banking world.
That's right. That's right. He was doing very well at a hedge fund in New York. Back then, he was the geeky technologist with the crazy laugh and the very, bad pleated khaki pants. And the transformation has been right in front of our eyes, right? As he's become a kind of business master of the universe, much better shape, courtside Wimbledon, moving much more easily among the circles of the political and business and Hollywood elite. That's one big change. But, Vlad, he has, been an inventor a little bit like Steve Jobs in terms of, Alexa and some other products there. I tell the story of that in Amazon Unbound. And then maybe the difference is he's also an empire builder. And, his appetite and ambitions have just grown over the years, and the expansion is in all directions. We're hearing now Amazon might buy MGM Studios. That's, I think, a difference and something, that really has transformed about him. He was so focused on Amazon, and today it's still Amazon, but it's also, he owns the Washington Post. He did battle for 4 years with the Trump administration. He's a creature of Hollywood. He's involved in space exploration with his company Blue Origin, and then increasingly, because I think the world is clamoring for it, he's become at least the beginning of a philanthropist committing $10 billion to fight climate change.
We're going to talk about that hopefully a little later on in this interview, but I want to talk about some of the criticism that Amazon has faced recently. Particularly, that criticism has ramped up with the dawn of the pandemic. The treatment of warehouse workers, including the fight to keep unions out of its business, and the negative impact that shipping has had on the environment. We saw sort of a host of commercials, I think maybe over the last year or so, touting Amazon's commitment to the environment. It was clear that the company was aware of this criticism. Do you think the bad press bothers Bezos? Does it have an impact on his decision making?
It definitely does. I mean, you can see them being reactive. Sometimes a little aggressively so. Their recent kind of corporate Twitter account was pretty punchy. On that critical issue of whether drivers need to relieve themselves in bottles during their long days. But, Anne-Marie, there are two pieces to it. One is unionization, and I write about this a lot in the book. The company is simply allergic to it and will fight like heck to kind of prevent collective bargaining and organizing in their fulfillment centers. We saw that in Bessemer, Alabama. Right now, the NLRB is weighing whether Amazon, broke the law in winning that union battle. And then the second thing is the environmental impact. It was employees who were kind of clamoring in 2019 for Amazon to release its climate impact report, and Bezos, in a very Bezos-like way, kind of turned around and said, we're gonna do something differently here, and conceived this thing called the Climate Pledge to basically commit Amazon and then other companies who signed up for it to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. So he hears the criticism. I do think it bothers him. His recent investor letter was all about addressing it. And, he's not leading, but he's reading, I think, some of these things and trying to get Amazon out in front, because he knows that customers need to feel good about clicking that buy button.
What's fascinating to me is, before the aughts and even before the 90s, we in this country had powerful CEOs, right? But it strikes me that Jeff Bezos is the combination of guys like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Juan Trippe, who ran Pan American Airways, and Louis B. Mayer. He's all these moguls in different industries in one individual. And what's fascinating to me about Amazon is those things. What he is doing now tripped up some of those old school moguls, right? Just thinking about William Paley at CBS in the 1960s, deciding to branch out from broadcasting to own everything from Fender guitars to other businesses, or Beatrice Foods that at one point owned Avis, right? What ends up happening is these companies get so big and they have so many different products and businesses that they collapse, or they're taken over. They're bought out by somebody else who then sells off those pieces, right? Because those pieces are worth more on their own than they are as a total. But he's not that guy. He's able to branch out into all these different things. I mean, he's now producing films just like Louis B. Mayer. MGM couldn't do what he's doing. Why is that?
Well, Vlad, it's interesting. One of the reasons why I call this book Amazon Unbound is exactly that. I felt, well, first, there's a nice little pun there on Amazon's escape from the book business. But I felt like the company was sort of uniquely unbound from the laws of corporate gravity that tend to pull down big companies. And it's because Bezos has created this ingenious invention, not just the cluster of products and services, but a kind of corporate culture that does remain, yes, inventive and very driven, and also kind of ruthless and driving. And, you hear the employee stories, and I tell a lot of them in the book. But I think the question's a good one, because it really, I think, is the big question for the next decade or so of Amazon history. Will it continue to be unbound? Will regulators and lawmakers catch up to it? Will there be nimble competition in another garage that takes a chunk of Amazon's business? So far, we don't see a lot of that. I think regulators are still playing catch up, but Bezos is retiring as CEO later this year. And we'll see if the company continues to be as inventive and nimble and relentless as it has been.
Let's talk a little bit about the National Enquirer scandal that brought to light Bezos' affair with his current girlfriend and the end of his marriage. And I think for a lot of us, we kind of had him in that group of kind of tech titans, and suddenly there was a window into this messiness that was happening that we had never seen before. And to Vlad's previous question about the evolution of Amazon and the man, I think for a lot of us too, that was the first time that we really took a good look at what Jeff Bezos looked like, because we saw images of him when he first got married, and it almost looked like he was aging in reverse, and he's all buff, and we were like, what happened to this man, right? And so I just want to ask you about, did you get any insight into how he navigated that period in his life? I'm sure he was not used to, that kind of exposure, in more ways than one, perhaps, to his private life, and just how he felt about the way he was being treated by the tabloids.
It was not an avenue that I expected to go down when I started the book, but I told the whole story, and I think get to the bottom of it in this book. And, it was remarkable because here was, he had conducted a relationship in broad daylight, had gotten busted by the National Enquirer, was seemingly cornered by adversaries, and in, perhaps a cynical but definitely ingenious maneuver, he won, right? He wrote that remarkable Medium post accusing the Enquirer of extorting him. He published their emails. He wrapped himself up in the mantle of the Washington Post and said it was a complexifier for him and intimated that there were political motivations to the article. I don't think there were. I think it was simply a tabloid story and a juicy one. But he did sort of win people's sympathies with the boldness of publishing their email. And let's face it, the Enquirer, particularly during the Trump years, was kind of easy to loathe. And he exploited that. And he comes out on top at the end. And maybe people remember it now with a fog of sort of ambiguity. Was it the Saudis? Was it Trump world? Well, in fact, it was Lauren Sanchez's brother, sending the emails and the text messages and some of the photographs to the Enquirer. And all that was sort of forgotten. So, Bezos winning again, pulling the levers of power and influence, perhaps manipulating the media and coming out on top.
Brad, how does he see himself in the world? I mean, what is his raison d'être? Like, does he see himself as, I think sometimes when people don't know these billionaires, they imagine that the only thing they care about is accumulating wealth and power, and that they are staunch capitalists in every sense of the word, and it's a zero-sum game, and that's how they play the game, and they're winning, and that's all that they care about. And I ask that because he had been criticized in the past for falling short on philanthropy, but recently the Associated Press reported that he was one of the top 50 U.S. donors this year. And again, because I love history, I do know that some of those old school robber barons, eventually later on in their lives, they made a commitment to give away most of their wealth in established institutions ranging from Carnegie Mellon University to Rockefeller Center. So I'm just wondering how he sees himself in the world and what he expects his legacy to be. I know he's still a young guy.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a clear answer to how he sees himself because he says it at every opportunity. He sees himself as an inventor, and that's how he wants to be seen. Now, I happen to have daughters, so Taylor Swift is big in this household, and I recall, she wants to be seen as a songwriter, but the world doesn't quite see her in that way, perhaps as a performer and a wonderful singer. And I think it's the same with Jeff Bezos, right? We don't really see him as an inventor. We see him as a business builder and a kind of ruthless capitalist. And so I think he understands that. Maybe he fights it a little bit. And he realizes he needs to work on his legacy. And so the philanthropy, which has ramped up, was purely reactive. Well, let's say it followed criticism that he was really solely focused on business building and invention and hadn't given much back. And so the past 2 years, we've seen that change. I think he probably does look to history and understands that part of aggregating this historic amount of wealth is going to be how he gives it away. And I want to be optimistic that, climate change and investing in new climate technologies and him applying his amazing intellect to the problem of climate change will have an impact.
I get that. I mean, we all of us, me, Anne-Marie, the world, we want to be seen the way we want to be seen. But if that's not how people perceive you, perception is part of it, right? I mean, when you say the word inventor to me, and I'm just talking about like Americans, I think Thomas Edison and I think Benjamin Franklin, the Wright brothers, and that's just here in the U.S. I mean, there's other people, Tesla, and, we can go on when we think about the word inventor. But when I think businessman, when I think mogul, I think Jeff Bezos. I mean, and is there, I guess the question is there anything wrong with that from his perspective?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Thomas Edison, and I actually start the book with a quote about Thomas Edison, and they are similar in some respects. Bezos is an inventor. He came up with the Kindle, came up with Alexa. A lot of that was unique. He sponsored the innovation. He created a system of invention among his employees that has allowed these things to happen. But I think you're right. It's a little bit overshadowed by his strengths as an operator and a business builder and a competitor and maybe just, maybe a monopolist, right? And these things are sort of trending in the wrong direction for Bezos and his image, which is why I think he's caretaking it a little bit.
Really interesting. I'm halfway through the book, Brad. It's really awesome. Thank you for coming on to talk about it. We really appreciate it. It's really, really interesting, a fascinating biography. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Brad, your book, Amazon Unbound, Jeff Bezos and the Invention of a Global Empire, is out now and available everywhere, including on Amazon.